It's Christmas Day, 1864. Sergeant John Clark Ely of the 115th Ohio Volunteer Infantry of the Union Army is shivering in the cold at a Confederate prison camp near Meridian, Mississippi. He was captured by Nathan Bedford Forrest's army just 3 weeks earlier in Tennessee. Several of his companions had already succumbed to exposure or disease. Despite the miserable conditions, he has managed to keep a journal. On this day, he writes, "Christmas Day, and such a day for prisoners. Hungry, dirty, sleepy, and lousy. Will another Christmas find us again among friends and loved ones?" Ely would soon be transferred to the infamous prison camp in Andersonville, Georgia, where conditions were far worse. But on March 24, 1865, he and hundreds of other sick and starving soldiers were released as part of a prisoner exchange. They were told to report to Camp Fisk, just a few miles from Vicksburg, Mississippi. After arriving at Camp Fisk on March 31st, Ely wrote, "Oh, this is the brightest day of my life, long to be remembered." After 3 weeks, finally it was his turn to be released. He writes, "Beautiful day, but very warm sun about 10 a.m. We were ordered to take a train for Vicksburg and then up the river, went from cars to the boat Sultana, a large but not very fine boat. Left sometime in the night for Cairo." 2 days later, on April 26th, Ely wrote his final journal entry. "Very fine day, still upward we go." Ely didn't know it, but he and approximately 1,200 others on board would lose their lives in the worst maritime disaster in American history. The SS Sultana, today, on Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs.
Welcome, everyone, to Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs, tales of mishaps, misfortune, and misadventures. I am so pleased to be bringing you episode 1. We will be talking today about the SS Sultana, a very tragic story, and I had the pleasure of talking with Jerry Potter, author of the Sultana Tragedy, America's Greatest Maritime Disaster, and he's going to be adding some really fantastic insight to the story, and I was so pleased to be able to talk to him. The open you heard today was taken from the diary of Sergeant John Clark Ely, and his diary has miraculously survived and has been preserved. Before we jump in, I think it's necessary to give a rather lightning quick explanation of the American Civil War for those listeners in other countries who just aren't familiar. Now, this is going to be a drastic oversimplification, so please forgive me. In 1861, 11 southern states of the United States seceded from the Union and declared themselves a new nation called the Confederate States of America. The Confederates opened the war by bombarding the Union garrison at Fort Sumter off the coast of South Carolina. As a result, a horrible war then raged for 4 years, with the Union ultimately prevailing, and the nation was kept together. But even today, you will often see people flying a Confederate battle flag across the American South and elsewhere. With that background in place, let's talk now about the events that led up to the tragedy of the Sultana. By early April 1865, the American Civil War had been going on for 4 years and was the bloodiest war in American history, with about 750,000 dead. But the war was coming to an end. General Robert E. Lee of the Confederate States and his Army of Northern Virginia were out of options and outnumbered and outflanked. General Lee had no choice but to surrender to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, on April 9, 1865. Some Confederates, including some generals, wanted to take to the mountains for a guerrilla war, but that never happened. Within a month, Generals Johnston, Taylor, and Forrest would also surrender. Union President Andrew Johnson didn't officially end the war for another 18 months. But back on April 9th, when Lee surrendered, this war was essentially finished. On April 14th, just 5 days after Lee's surrender, John Wilkes Booth shot President Lincoln at Ford's Theater, and Lincoln would die the next day. Booth would eventually be tracked down and killed by Union soldiers, but his actions really put the nation into a state of mourning and disbelief. Meanwhile, there was the business of putting a war-torn country back together. Part of this process was figuring out how to get Union prisoners of war home from Confederate prison camps. There were thousands of starving, weak, and diseased prisoners on both sides that needed to be transported home. During the early years of the war, prisoners often were exchanged because neither side really wanted to house and care for prisoners, so they just swapped prisoners and everyone just went home happy. But in 1863, this really broke down when the Confederacy stopped recognizing black Union soldiers as prisoners of war. Instead, the Confederates enslaved captured black soldiers and often executed their commanding officers. The Union, as you could probably guess, wasn't happy about this, and they responded with executions of their own, and as a result, prisoner exchanges really just stopped, and the numbers of prisoners on both sides began to swell. Those lucky enough to survive the infamous Andersonville prison camp in Georgia, as well as those at Cahaba in Alabama, were loaded into overcrowded train cars and sent to Camp Fisk, just a few miles southeast of Vicksburg, Mississippi. But some of the men who didn't make it on a train walked hundreds of miles just to get to this camp. Witnesses at the time described these men almost like zombies just lumbering across the land. So, what does any of this have to do with the Sultana? Well, you'll see. So, engines full ahead. Let's talk about the Sultana. The Sultana was a privately owned side-wheeler steamboat. It had coal-burning boilers and launched in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1863. It was 260 feet long, 42 feet wide, and designed for a crew of 85 for a total capacity of 376 people plus some cargo. During the war, the Sultana had been hired by the United States government as a Union supply and transport ship, including at the Battle of Vicksburg in July of 1863. The Sultana had made many runs up and down the Mississippi River from St. Louis to New Orleans during the war. The Sultana's captain was James Cass Mason, and he was also part owner of the Sultana. Mason was a civilian captain of his ship and not a military captain, just to clarify. There will be several military captains mentioned just a bit later, so I want to avoid any confusion. The Sultana was part of the Merchants and Peoples Line, which had a contract with the government to transport troops and cargo. Here is Jerry Potter to tell us what happened when Captain Mason reached Vicksburg.
The Sultana was coming downriver in mid-April of 1865, and already there were about 5,000 prisoners at a parole camp 3 miles out east of Vicksburg, waiting to be carried upriver on privately owned steamboats. And the General Dana at Vicksburg had ordered 1,000 men be placed on each steamboat to be carried upriver. And the government set how much the owners of the steamboats were to be paid to carry each enlisted man, each officer upriver. So the Sultana came downriver. It docked at Vicksburg. In fact, the Sultana was actually carried the news of Lincoln's assassination with her downriver. She was the first steamboat that left Cairo after Lincoln's assassination. So the boat docked at Vicksburg, and waiting on the bank was Colonel Reuben Hatch. And there was a meeting between Hatch and Mason, and it's my belief that at that meeting, Hatch promised Mason a large load of passengers for his upriver trip. We know that. I mean, there's testimony to that effect. And Mason told his first clerk that there would be no problem about getting all the men that he wanted on his upriver trip. And clearly, Hatch agreed uh, to place all the men on the upriver on Mason's upriver trip in return for a portion of the money that the government was going to be paying Mason to carry the men. And what's fascinating, uh, Hatch had done the same thing earlier in the war at Cairo and had been caught red-handed in taking bribes and should have been court-martialed, but his brother O.M. Hatch, who was Secretary of State for the state of Illinois, intervened and got President Lincoln, who was a friend of not only O.M. Hatch and Reuben Hatch, but also um, had received a large financial contribution from O.M. Hatch during his presidential campaigns. And so it was Lincoln that intervened and appointed a civilian commission to investigate the charges against Reuben Hatch. And two of the three commissioners were from the state of Illinois, where Reuben Hatch was from. And probably not surprising that the commissioners found that Reuben Hatch was nothing more than an honest man. And as a result, he was ultimately ended up in Vicksburg. And so indirectly, Lincoln kind of played a role in this disaster. But it was that meeting between Hatch and Mason where the deal was struck before the Sultana left to go south towards New Orleans.
A couple years later, Hatch resigned his commission from the Army after several lawsuits were brought against him. 3 months later, however, he wanted to rejoin the Army. Ozias Hatch, his brother, intervened again, wrote to Lincoln, and this time the president wrote to his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. O.M. Hatch, whom I would like to oblige, wants Captain R.B. Hatch made a quartermaster in the regular army. I know not whether it can be done conveniently, but if it can, I would like it.
In January of 1865, Reuben Hatch appeared before an examining board in New Orleans to be tested on his knowledge about the rules and regulations of the office of an assistant quartermaster. He appeared out of uniform because he had lost his uniform 6 months before. And that was shocking to me that an officer would not have a uniform for 6 months. But he was tested, and now I'm going to paraphrase what the examining officers reported after the examination was concluded. They said of all the people tested, none had the deficiency of knowledge as did Colonel Hatch, and that either it was culpable negligence that allowed him to continue in the role of an assistant quartermaster, or he had some type of mental disability. But regardless, he was unqualified to serve in the role of an assistant quartermaster. 2 weeks later, he's appointed chief quartermaster for the Department of Mississippi and sent to Vicksburg.
But Reuben Hatch wasn't the only officer that Mason met with that day. Determined to get his share of the men on the Sultana, he also arranged a meeting with Brigadier General Morgan L. Smith, who, like Mason, was from St. Louis. Mason explained the situation and again demanded the Sultana be given a shipload of the prisoners. General Smith guaranteed to Mason that he would receive a full complement of men when the Sultana returned from its stop in New Orleans. Smith went even a step further, instructing Mason to personally inform him if anyone did not cooperate with his plan. Mason was satisfied with this guarantee, and he returned to the Sultana and continued on to New Orleans. After stopping briefly to pick up a small load of passengers, Mason left New Orleans on April 21st and began its trip back north to Vicksburg, carrying about 250 passengers and crew. During this time, back at Camp Fisk, Captain Frederick Speed volunteered to begin preparing the rolls of men to be boarded onto the steamboats that began arriving in Vicksburg to transport them home. His commanding officer, Captain George Williams, had been sent to Cairo to deliver reports back to Washington, D.C. So Speed stepped up to take his place. Captain Williams was the overall officer in command of the prisoner exchange, and, well, his background was pretty shady too.
Captain George Williams was also at Vicksburg. And Captain George Williams really was fascinating when I started researching his background, because he played a major role in placing all the men on the Sultana on April 24th, when the boat came back from New Orleans and docked at Vicksburg. And Captain Williams was a graduate of West Point, class of 1852, and he was still a captain, which is because most of his classmates who were still in the Army were generals, some of them major generals. And why was George Williams still a captain? Well, the reason I concluded was he was corrupt, and he was a bad officer. In 1864, he was at Memphis, and he was caught taking bribes to release Confederate sympathizers out of the prisons in Memphis. He would take a bribe and he would release the prisoners. And then there was a prison in downtown Memphis called the Irvin Block Prison, and he was in charge of that prison. And the Army made a surprise inspection of that prison and found the conditions so horrible for the prisoners in that prison that they kicked George Williams out of the Army. And he would have been out of the Army and would never have been at Vicksburg, except General Grant and Sherman came to his aid, and he was allowed to go back into the Army and was sent to Vicksburg. So the cesspool was full.
By this time, the docks at Vicksburg were bustling. On April 22nd, the Henry Ames arrived in Vicksburg and, like the Sultana, was part of the Merchants and People's Line. Captain Speed prepared the rolls for 800 men to be placed on the Henry Ames, but it turned out over 1,300 were allowed to board, and the ship pulled away from Vicksburg later that day. General Dana watched as the men boarded the Henry Ames and said, "I had taken great interest in expediting the departure of these brave fellows to their homes." General Dana really wanted to get these men home. He wanted to expedite the entire situation, get them out of Camp Fisk, get them onto the boats, and get them home. And the fact that these boats all had more men on them than were allowed is testament to that. The following day, on April 23rd, the Olive Branch, a smaller steamship belonging to the competing line of the Atlantic and Mississippi, received another 700 men. But Captain Speed became suspicious following the departure of the Olive Branch, suspecting bribery had taken place. Speed reported to General Dana and asked permission to arrest Captain Kearns, who was the quartermaster in Vicksburg, specifically responsible for river transportation. Speed claimed he had given orders to Captain Kearns to immediately report the arrival of all ships to him directly. But the Olive Branch arrived at 1 o'clock a.m., and Speed was not notified until 9 o'clock a.m. Speed told General Dana that Kearns had received what he called pecuniary compensation from the Merchants and People's Line to delay the loading of prisoners until one of their own ships, the Sultana, could arrive in Vicksburg. However, General Dana refused to take any action, claiming an investigation had to be conducted before any arrests could be made. And this would not be the last time that a senior officer failed to act. But in fact, it was Reuben Hatch himself who told Captain Speed that he suspected Kearns of taking bribes. Hatch also claimed he had not been informed of the Olive Branch until 9 a.m. Kearns later testified that Hatch was lying, and he in fact did tell Hatch about the Olive Branch's arrival, but Hatch simply did not pass this information to Captain Speed. So Hatch was doing some misdirection here, trying to frame Kearns as the person who was arranging the bribes, while also doing his best to delay and make sure as many men as possible would be placed on the Sultana, which was on its way but had not yet arrived in Vicksburg. The subject of bribery would continue to swirl through Vicksburg. George Williams had been told by Reuben Hatch's assistant, Lieutenant William Tillinghast, that Speed was receiving 50 cents per man to delay the men back at Camp Fisk so they could be placed on a ship from the Atlantic and Mississippi. Williams reported this allegation to General Dana, and Dana told him that Captain Speed reported a similar claim earlier about Captain Kearns. Williams then therefore determined his allegations must be incorrect. In truth, it was Tillinghast himself who had been arranging the bribes, and he would later admit this. The Vicksburg agent for the Atlantic and Mississippi line had offered Tillinghast 15 cents per man. Captain Mason also offered Tillinghast a bribe, stating that if he had his measure, it should cost him nothing for clothing for a whole year. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but I would guess that he was going to have some suits tailored for him or something of the like. Nevertheless, Tillinghast admitted later to these bribes on April 27th, after the fate of the Sultana had already been sealed. While all that was going on, the Sultana was still on its way back to Vicksburg. Chief Engineer Nathan Wintringer kept a close eye on the boilers. Another crew member named Henry J. Lyda, who left the Sultana while it was in New Orleans, later said that the boiler had to be repaired in Natchez, Mississippi, and again in Vicksburg on its previous 2 journeys. Wintringer certainly knew about the boiler repairs as the chief engineer and was clearly concerned about the conditions of the boilers. And this turned out to be warranted because one of the ship's boilers sprung a leak on its way to Vicksburg.
The Sultana was coming upriver. It stopped at Vicksburg on the evening of April 23rd. One of the boilers was leaking. The middle larboard boiler had one of the riveted seams had buckled and steam was escaping. Speed had replaced George Williams as the officer in charge of the prisoner exchange. Williams had been initially placed in charge of the prisoner exchange, but he had been sent upriver to Cairo to communicate with Washington about the exchange. So on the 23rd, it was Frederick Speed that was in charge of the loading the men on steamboats. He'd already sent about 1,700 men on the Olive Branch and the Henry Ames. And the Olive Branch had left Vicksburg shortly before the Sultana arrived. And because Speed did not have the records prepared, he decided that he was not going to place any men on the Sultana, that it would take 2 to 3 days to complete the paperwork. And so he told Captain J. Cass Mason initially that no men would be placed on the Sultana. So then Mason goes to meet Hatch. And while these meetings are going on, the first engineer had gone into Vicksburg and found R.G. Taylor, a local boiler maker, to come on board the Sultana and examine the leaking boiler. And he does, and he tells the first engineer the boiler would take several days to repair because several sheets had to be removed in order to do a complete repair job. He walked off the boat and said, unless I'm able to do a complete repair job, I want nothing to do with the repairs. Well, for some reason, he came back on the boat and ended up placing a very small, thin patch over the buckled area. And that would take several hours. In fact, he was still working on the boiler when the soldiers were being loaded on the Sultana on the following day, April 24th. So there was a lot going on the evening of April 23rd. But probably the most important event for that evening was George Williams arrived back into Vicksburg. And it was George Williams who told Speed there was no reason to prepare the rolls in advance, that the paperwork could be prepared after the Sultana left. And so he finally, initially, Speed disagreed and refused to do it. But finally, and this is where Speed had some culpability, if you will, because he finally agreed to what Williams was demanding or proposing. He decided or agreed to load all the remaining prisoners on the one boat the following day. And that was a decision that ultimately cost about 1,200 lives because Speed thought there were only about 1,500 prisoners remaining. Because of that belief, he decided to place all of the men on the Sultana the following day. And there were more than 2,000 men at the parole camp waiting to be transported.
Before any of the prisoners arrived in Vicksburg from Camp Fisk, the Lady Gay had arrived, which was another ship of the Merchants and Peoples Line, like the Sultana. Captain Kearns, who had no involvement or knowledge of the number of prisoners at Camp Fisk, did not believe the Sultana could handle all the prisoners and reported the arrival of the Lady Gay to Reuben Hatch, and he requested that she receive some of the remaining prisoners. Hatch claimed it was the order of Speed and Captain George Williams that all the men should be placed on the Sultana. Speed and Williams had both been vocal about making sure the Merchants and Peoples Line ships received the men because of the contract with the federal government. However, Hatch and Mason had already arranged and manipulated this agreement to put all the men on the Sultana. Captain Kearns had no choice but to inform the Lady Gay that she would receive none of the men, and the Lady Gay left Vicksburg with no passengers. With the temporary repairs on the Sultana's boiler underway, Speed and Williams began preparations to begin transporting the men from Camp Fisk to the docks at Vicksburg.
On the morning of April 24th, George Williams and Frederick Speed had agreed to travel by train the 3 miles from Vicksburg to the parole camp. Again, that was east of Vicksburg. And it was decided that Speed would stay at the parole camp and be in charge of placing the men by states on the trains to take them into Vicksburg to be placed on the Sultana. Williams agreed to ride with the first trainload of men and be responsible for counting the men as they boarded the boat. So Williams did. He rode with the first trainload, and he counted the men from that trainload, and then counted the men from a train that arrived around 4 p.m. Uh, and counted the men from that train load that boarded the Sultana. And that was the train load that had the Kentucky soldiers and the Tennessee soldiers on it. What neither Williams nor Speed realized that there was a second or middle train that left the parole camp around noon, and there were approximately 400 men that boarded the Sultana that neither Speed nor Williams counted.
As Captain Kearns watched an already overcrowded Sultana be loaded with more men, he appealed once more to General Smith, citing his concerns. He asked General Smith to personally be present at the docks when the last group of men boarded the Sultana, hoping Smith would see the danger. Smith agreed, but was later informed, erroneously, that only 300 more men would be arriving, so he returned to his office. Colonel Hatch also left the docks when he was reminded that the transfer of prisoners was out of his hands.
Well, Captain Kearns, who was, if there was a hero, it was Captain Kearns, William Kearns. He was an assistant quartermaster in charge of river transportation at Vicksburg, and he was one that really should have selected what steamboats to carry the men. And he became concerned during the day of April 24th that too many men were being placed on the Sultana. And there were 2 other steamboats, a Pauline Carroll and another steamboat, that were trying to get a load of prisoners to carry upriver. And Kearns tried to get the men divided among these 3 steamboats. Unfortunately, Williams refused to do it. Speed, for some reason, said that all the records had been prepared for the men to go on the one boat, the Sultana, and Kearns went to his superior, Reuben Hatch, trying to get the men divided, and it even went to General Dana, and Dana said he had nothing to do with the prisoner exchange or the prisoner transportation. So in the end, the other two steamboats went upriver with a total of 17 passengers, and the Sultana left with over 2,200. In fact, there were so many men on the Sultana that the decks sagged, and the crew had to place additional supports between the decks to keep the decks from collapsing.
But Kearns was not the only man worried about the number of men on board the Sultana. Back at Camp Fisk, an assistant quartermaster confronted Speed about the number of men being assigned to the Sultana. Speed replied sharply, "Officers sometimes are dismissed from the service for meddling with that which is none of their business." Another subordinate, who was in charge of records at Camp Fisk, also questioned Speed. He later recalled getting a, quote, humiliating reprimand for presuming the inquiry. In command of all the prisoners aboard the Sultana was Major William Fiddler. Fiddler voiced his concerns to Mason about the number of men aboard, but Mason told him there was nothing he could do. All the men would be placed on the Sultana. A witness who was aboard the Pauline Carroll heard the last group of soldiers to board the Sultana complaining, "There was no room for them to lie down or a place to attend to the calls of nature. There was much indignation. They said they were not going to be packed on the boat like damned hogs." Some men who asked why they could not be placed on the Pauline Carroll were told that the ship was infected with smallpox. Now, this was a complete and utter fabrication. Dr. George Kemble was the medical director for the Department of Mississippi, and he too was worried about the conditions aboard the ship. Many of the men were sick and did not have adequate space. Dr. Kemble ordered 23 sick men that he had earlier put on the Sultana to be removed from the ship. Captain Williams objected, but Kemble ignored him and removed the men anyway. He then ordered a group of 278 more men who were arriving from a local hospital to turn around and go back to the hospital. Thanks to Dr. Kemble, these men would not travel on the Sultana, and they were spared the suffering to come. Lieutenant Harvey Annis, who was not a paroled prisoner of war, was returning home aboard the Sultana with his wife and child. After boarding, he became very concerned about the number of men on the ship, saying there was great fear felt by everybody on account of the large number of passengers and the boat being top-heavy. Even the ship's clerk, William Gambrel, noticed the sagging of the hurricane deck despite all the additional supports that were put in place, and he ordered that no more men be placed on the top deck. In his book, Loss of the Sultana and Reminiscences of the Survivors, Chester Berry describes how Gambrel went on to tell one of the prisoners that if we arrived safe at Cairo, it would be the greatest trip ever made on the western waters, as there were more people on board than were ever carried on one boat on the Mississippi River. Captain Williams informed Speed that he counted 1,996 men on board the Sultana. This actually turned out to be an error in his math, and later reported the number was 1,866. This number shocked Captain Speed. The number of men, as far as he understood, should have been no more than 1,400. But even this corrected count of 1,866 was not correct. The 400 men who arrived on that second train were uncounted and unknown to either Williams or Speed. A number of men who were forced to walk or find other transportation to Vicksburg were also uncounted, and Williams failed to consider the 100 or so passengers who purchased tickets, 21 military guards, and the 85 crew members. In total, the number of passengers is estimated to be about 2,500 on a steamboat certified for a capacity of 376. Lieutenant Rosine, who was the record keeper at Camp Fisk, recorded the transfer of 2,146 prisoners, which is far closer to reality. The number of passengers wasn't the only thing adding to the instability of the ship. Aboard the Sultana were also 100 horses and mules, 100 pigs, 200 hogshead of sugar, and I did not know exactly what a hogshead was, so I had to look it up. A hogshead was a type of barrel. Also, there was 97 cases of wine and even a large alligator in a pen, which served as the crew's pet, believe it or not. Despite all the obvious warnings, protestations by passengers, and multiple complaints of Captain Kearns, the Sultana finally left Vicksburg at 9 p.m. on April 24th, 1865. Well, that is going to do it for part 1 of the Sultana. A huge thank you to Jerry Potter. We're going to hear a lot more from him in the next episode. His book is called The Sultana Tragedy, America's Greatest Maritime Disaster. And you can find it on arcadiapublishing.com, Amazon, or support your local bookstore. Thank you all so much for listening. Please don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please also rate and review us on Apple Podcasts for you Apple folks, or podchaser.com for you Android folks. It only takes a moment, costs you nothing, and it will really help people find us. Speaking of helping people find us, tell a friend. Most of the podcasts I listen to were recommended by friends or family, so tell a friend about us. It'll really help. Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is written, edited, and produced by me, Rich Napolitano. Our outstanding original theme music is written by Sean Siegfried, and you can follow his YouTube channel at Sean Secret. Please follow us on Instagram and Twitter at ShipwrecksPod, or visit us at shipwrecksandseadogs.com. And please, do your part to protect our oceans by reducing your use of plastics. It's time to cut and run. Thanks for listening.